Okay, and we are live. This is episode number 8 of Absolute AppSec. I'm Ken Johnson. Got co-host Seth. Seth, you want to say hi?
Hey, everybody. Welcome yet again.
Seth Law. And special guest tonight, Neil. Neil, can you say your last name? Because I always screw it up.
It's Matatall.
Matatall. I always say it wrong. So, Neil... Yeah, I don't know what it is about that. I think it's the spelling. It's just always like kind of screws with. I don't know if everyone has that same problem, but anyways, moving forward. Yeah, so we've got Neil with us. Yes, please say hi, Neil.
How's it going, everyone? I guess I can't answer.
Yeah. Well, they can in the live chat. They can answer in the live chat. So, yeah. I guess they could say hi back. So, I'm going to give a little introduction, specific to Neil, obviously. So I've known Neil since you and I started communicating pretty heavily back at you were working at Twitter. I was working at Living Social, and we were both working security for Rails, heavy Rails shops, Ruby on Rails, and like trying to keep up with all the stuff that was happening, CVs being released, keeping on top of stuff that wasn't always public. So we were basically sharing information back and forth, and like that's how we started communicating. But in terms of sort of well, you know what? Before we get to that, let me mention a few other things. So Neil is the creator of Secure Headers. So it's a gem that basically helps. It's exactly like it sounds. Like it's security centric headers. It helps set security centric headers in your Rails applications. Neil's going to talk about that in a much more educated fashion. We're going to talk a little bit about CSP. But that's sort of Neil's background. He has a lot of time spent with dealing with web standards and a lot of insight there. So we're going to ask him some questions about all that. Web security specific standards. And then he's got a blog. So some of the things that we talk about, they're going to be referenced, or he's written blog posts that can be referenced. You can go to oreoshake.github.com. That's his blog. And I think hopefully I've introduced you correctly, Neil, and you can start chatting.
Thanks for the introduction.
Well, yeah, I mean, before we get into it, let's give you a chance to kind of give us a rundown of what you're currently doing, where you're at, what your kind of current research projects are. If you just want to give us a little bit of background before we dive into the topics, I guess, that we have.
Sure. So I've been with GitHub for about 3.5 years now, and I was sort of started out on the security team, and then I was on the AppSec team, and then the AppSec team split into product security and application security. Ken's on application security, I'm on product security, and for the longest time, the split was mostly superficial, and in recent I would say months even, it became more official, which actually let me focus more on things that, I get to focus day to day as opposed to sort of the onslaught of unplanned work that can come with the AppSec role. Mm-hmm. So sort of less bounty, more features. And it's let me focus really on sort of the whole account security story at GitHub. So first, that's going to start off with just better notifications about activity on your account. I did a quick comparison with GitHub, Facebook, Stripe, Heroku, sort of companies that may or may not have a good overlap with GitHub users as well. And it turns out we were way behind the curve on even simple things such as email notifications. We were good about, hey, your password changed, or hey, an SSH key changed, but there were lots of gaps where you wouldn't be notified otherwise. That's just sort of the beginning. That helps us build just sort of a better story about getting people to be more aware about the security. And that'll spin off into sort of a like account security checkup sort of deal, which I think, bigger companies like Facebook and Google are doing a really good job of, where they just sort of say, hey, maybe you want to take a look at your account, highlight some things that are maybe potentially, extra risky, as opposed to things that are maybe just sort of FYIs. And then from there, just really like making the whole account security process like easy to use, foolproof as much as possible, because account lockouts are a huge problem. Anyone who's implemented two-factor and has maintained it for years knows that this is going to be like the number one reason your support team might not be your best friend at all times, because a lot of us do a really poor job at making their job even remotely easy.
Yeah.
And I think, with the introduction of things like delegated recovery and just sort of a more modern thinking towards the approach, I think we can make a big impact on both the number of people who enroll in 2FA and the number of people who continue to be enrolled in 2FA.
In terms of recovery, I know you've, I know you've mentioned, I've heard, and by the way, sorry I didn't mention that we work together. Yes, we work together at GitHub. I should have mentioned that. But yeah, so I've heard you mention Google before as, and I think it was in a positive light as an example of account recovery. If so, or if not, like if you've got a good example of someone who's doing that properly and why, that would be awesome.
Well, it's important to remember like the audience. The audience is very important here. Google's user base is, well, there's most GitHub users will have a Google account. Only a fraction of Google users have a GitHub account. So we have the benefit of like having sort of a more technical audience. So what works for Google might not necessarily work for us. I do think that Google and Facebook, based on, I don't know, a few days of research in a very unscientific way, I do think they are like the perfect example of how to do it. And so I think everyone should strive to do like at least what they do, and then maybe something a little bit better. There's a lot of people who say that having to provide a phone number has a lot of drawbacks. There's some privacy concerns. There's the, attack at the SS7, whatever. Then there's the, hey, I called your phone company and said I was you problem. Like, some people don't want that option. And a lot of times to get these sort of higher levels of security, you need this extra level of recovery. And now this extra level of recovery has sort of lowered your bar. And a lot of these systems aren't very flexible in that regard. So I think what we're shooting for is to find like the perfect middle ground of like encouraging the low risk users to enroll in two-factor, giving the incredibly paranoid people in the high risk accounts the option to just really have this super lockdown mode with like no options whatsoever. And I think Google gives the most flexibility in that regard, but I don't know that their model is perfect for GitHub users. I was kind of looking at, in the other apps, I was kind of thinking like, who realistically could mandate 2FA for all their users? And I don't think GitHub is in that position. We have lots of people who are less technical and more likely to become locked out. But I was looking at the companies like maybe Heroku. Like their user base seems to be almost mostly technical, and not that only technical people can handle 2FA. It's just I've seen higher numbers of enrollment in technical user bases than non-technical.
And that makes sense. I mean, that's where a lot of it comes from, right? I mean, this is incredibly relevant. A couple weeks ago, we had Kevin Cody on, and he ended up locking himself out of his 2FA on GitHub. I don't know if you heard that. And it was mainly because he pulled away the recovery option to go to his phone, right, Ken? If I understood that right.
Actually, it was really, yeah, it was basically, it was kind of a weirdness with the Duo app, where if you do recovery with the Duo app, you can, meaning like you're saying, I want to kind of like, I guess I'm trying to switch phones. I think that was what he was saying. Like you tell the app that's what you're trying to do. And so when he took a picture of the QR code from GitHub, it guessed and said, "Oh, this must be what you wanted for your
your personal account."
Like, yeah, so it overwrote.
Yeah, that's right.
It overwrote his GitHub. Yeah, exactly what you said. And
I mean, that's not a typical kind of user hey, I forgot my password issue or 2FA issue. But I don't know. I mean, this is part of why I love doing this podcast, Neil, because you're bringing up a whole bunch of stuff that, I'm not necessarily in that product security role, but I do run into apps, and it would be interesting to think about it from this perspective rather than just, hey, do you have 2FA? And what that actually introduces on a development perspective, or to the developers, and how much overhead goes into that. Because we don't think about that a lot of times coming from the outside is, hey, is 2FA available? And that's about as far as we go.
Yeah, it's a lot of people have opinions. I think a lot of people haven't spent much time in the trenches in that regard.
Yeah.
And a lot of people say, I've straight up seen people laughing at other people on Twitter because they use SMS. And then so-and-so might get locked out of their account because they had TOTP with no backups. And it's like, well, that SMS is sounding pretty good right about now. It's that second half of the story that you really have to focus on. And I mean, personally, I use Authy because my phone bricks all the time. When Twitter released their two-factor, there was a story about losing a phone in the ocean. That story was not made up. That was my phone. I had to get my account unlocked, but luckily I was an employee. Shit happens. 2FA is hard. There's no solution for everyone.
Trying to find that link now because that is awesome. That is awesome. No, I think that's what's interesting about sort of Neil. What's most interesting is because a lot of the people in our network, or friends or whatever, we are more on the side of trying to, and to be fair, Neil's done a bunch of that, but in terms of our primary core focus, it's usually finding vulnerabilities and then yes, providing the solution, but we're not really thinking about the core functionality as it relates to, for instance, the GitHub has the commit signing. Well, that's no simple feat whatsoever, and it doesn't it's features like that Neil has dealt with, and it's incredibly complex, and I Neil, that makes sense what you're saying with regards to the user pay. Really depends heavily in terms of your design decisions on your user base.
Now, oh, sorry about that. And those of you that don't know Neil's background, he worked with me for all of 2 months at a consulting firm at one point. But I remember having discussions with you, or I can't remember. I'm pretty sure it was with you about, guess what? I don't necessarily want to be on the offensive side. I want to be on the defensive side, right? And you wanted more code. And at the time, the consulting firms and the application security space, it was all about offense, right? It was about, hey, we're going to go scan this app. We're going to find vulnerabilities. Then we're going to tell you generically how to fix it, right?
And it wasn't scan source code. It was, here's a URL and some creds, maybe.
Yeah. And then half the time the app wouldn't work, or it was all manual, right? I mean, anybody who's been in the space has dealt with that before. But, we've seen the industry kind of grow up, and I think you were on the forefront of that for sure, because you were more focused on the product side and actually how the rubber hits the road with the developers. I mean, what has been your career progression as far as that goes, right? Getting into product security versus kind of this application security offensive role.
So it all started with eBay. I started selling things that my dad's warehousing business would acquire when people would go out of business. And I thought HTML was the coolest thing in the world. Turning some characters into a bulleted list blew my mind when I was 15, 16, whatever. Just by happenstance, my school started offering a C++ class, and a friend of mine was taking it, and he convinced me to take it, and I fell in love with coding. And I love writing code. I love dealing with code. I like making code pretty. I like learning new ways to code. I like learning new languages. Just really an obsession with code. When I graduated college, my internship role offered me sort of a temporary role while they found something better for me, just because of timing. And that was still just straight development role. I had not done any security up to this point whatsoever. As they were waiting for the other role to say, they said, hey, we have this other thing in security. And I was vaguely interested and I wanted to try it out. And they said, come up with a training course on OWASP Top 10. And so through learning the OWASP Top 10, I was like, okay, I like hacking things. And I love the fact that it comes back to code and that you can fix it. I did sort of that offensive thing for a few years. And definitely the consulting gig was the last straw because that was like pure black box for the most part. I'm sorry, my dog loves to bark.
No.
And so I think at that point I had become burnt out. Like I said, instead of giving me an URL, just give me the code. I want to look at the code. I can find 10 times the bugs looking at the code than I could poking at a few endpoints. And after that, I actually went into a full-time development role. I thought, forget this security thing. Like, I'm done with this. I want to code. And I did that for a really long time until one of my friends was like, hey, what if you wanted to like be a defender where you could write code, but you're still doing security? It's a really good thing to get into. And like forever thankful. And from that point on, I was a defender, starting at Twitter through GitHub, and I'm not looking back.
Cool.
I definitely respect, like, the offensive stuff is super important. And I love seeing people blow my mind all the time. But for me, it's just like, just give me the code.
Totally can, I mean, I think both Seth and I can totally relate to that for sure. Who was the friend, by the way? What wasn't Justin, was it?
It was Alex Mullen, actually.
Oh, okay.
And started going back to the human aspect and the different use case aspect. He's a great person. If you can ever like find a chance to talk to him for like 10, 15 minutes, it probably changes your perspective on a lot of things. And he was actually behind the original two-factor implementation at Twitter. And for all the flack it got, I think he did a great job. And I think everything he did was spot on. But users are hard. Twitter's a hard use case to solve. I mean, billions of users on billions of devices and billions of living situations makes it really weird.
You know, I feel like I've met Alex at AppSec USA 2016 or something in a Netflix talk. I have to ask him. I'm pretty sure I've met him.
Well, he was the one that presented with me at LastCon when we did the secure automation talk. I mean, he's been around the OWASP circuit for quite a while.
Oh, well, maybe we should reach out to him at some point.
Yeah,
for sure. Oh, speaking of OWASP circles and conferences, before I forget, I did want to briefly have you explain just tell everybody about Local MocoSec and of course the diversity fund, which I think probably relates pretty well to, to your story. So yeah, if you could just let everyone in on like what you're doing there.
Okay, so the quick 5-year history is that this will be the 5th conference I've organized and the 2nd one that I've founded. I also helped found AppSec California, and every single one of these events has been very much like defensive focused. There's definitely been some attack stuff in there as well, and they've all been your sort of 4-track like mega conferences in a sense. I mean, I don't know if 4 tracks is considered mega, but to me it kind of is. Jim Manico, okay. Jim Manico basically nerd sniped me into organizing an event out in Hawaii. And when I said, well, I want to make it a single track event. I want to do invite only for the first round. I want it to be Defender and developer centric stuff, only. And, everyone was on board. We got Jeremiah Grossman on board. And I think we put together a really good lineup. You can go to localmocosec.com. Everyone's listed there. It's a single track 2-day event, April 5th and 6th. We've got training 2 days before. Yeah, we hope it'll be a great event. We also have sponsorship opportunities, obviously, but one of the things we're really trying to push is our diversity inclusion sponsorship, where all the money that comes in from that sponsorship will put directly to the hotel, airfare, and training costs for someone to attend the event from a background where maybe they haven't had a chance to have their employer sponsor such an event, or maybe they just can't afford it. I mean, it's not a cheap trip, and we're not trying to discount that. but getting as many people as we can to the event is great. And people like Uber and Brakeman Pro have stepped up to help fund some of these people. And we've got 4 people going so far, and we definitely have room for a lot more. And then finally, whatever loose change is left over from the travel will go directly to charity. We're not looking to directly profit off of this. Yes, we're filling our room block. Yes, we're helping cover the cost of food. But like, this is like, we're not doing this to just get more money.
Yeah, no, and I feel like I've known you long enough. That totally makes sense and is in line with who you are. So that's awesome that you guys are putting this on. I can't wait. I mean, what is it like? It's very cold and disgusting here in Northern Virginia. So we got about a month before there's some nice. Oh yeah, I mean, did I mention at the top that you're based out of Hawaii? I don't know if I did. But yeah.
And I don't know that I mentioned it when I was talking about Lokomogasek either, but it's in Kailua Kona on the Big Island of Hawaii, which is about a 15-minute drive from where I am right now.
That's
terrible
tough. Working conditions. Yeah. as Seth is in Salt Lake.
I should show you the 1.5 foot of snow that's right outside my window here, and yeah, it's been a bad couple of weeks in Salt Lake. So
yeah, I just remember one Monday you being like, I was like, how'd it go over the weekend? And you're like, yeah, it's like 2 feet of snow. So I spent half the day trying to,
dig out my garage and.
Yeah. But yeah, Neil's got it rough, real rough.
Yep, can't complain.
So before we move on to another topic, I did want there was a good this was a pretty good question, and it was how do you all feel? But Neil, I'm gonna obviously definitely want to get your take, but it's how do you all feel about passwordless gaining more traction? And I have to see what all passwordless, because it's been a while since I've looked at that. Passwordless options are out there.
Well, it's funny that question came up because Alex Mullen was one of the first people I know to actually provide, and I believe it was just a Ruby gem, so you could have password authentication to your app. Funny timing. I don't know if that's related, but I mean, I like the idea. Passwords suck. We need to change something. Relying on an email address is not exactly my favorite thing, but I don't exactly have a better alternative unless it's like the social type stuff.
Yeah, I will say I do enjoy the Slack magic link. Yeah, I'm gonna put in a link here, but yeah, I love the Slack because I always set incredibly ridiculously long passwords, and when it comes to doing that on the phone, like that's the only app that I found that has a good. Then again, I don't really install a whole lot of apps, but that app is just the only one that I found that makes it pretty seamless. And for those who don't know, I'm sure most people on here do know, when you go to say, hey, on the app, I want to add an account, you put in your email address. It will say, hey, which space do you want to sign into? Okay, do you want a magic link or do you want to put your password in? If you do the magic link, you check your email, you click on the link, it redirects, and it's signed you in on the Slack app through email to Safari to opening the Slack app and having you signed in. So it's kind of like, I mean, Neil, would you say it's pretty much like almost like a password reset token in a way, in that it's the rules around it, I would think, but I could be totally off base. Like the requirements.
Magic links are magic, right? Gets you one click to your account.
Just don't send it to Ken, right? That's
I mean, obviously, someone has to say use cases matter, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, and to be fair, right, that getting rid of the passwords that definitely makes it easier. I think the use of password managers, whether that's 1Password or LastPass, makes that easier as well, but not quite as easy as the magic link goes, right? Because then at that point I have to generate a password, I have to store it in one location, and then I have to bring it back up in my mobile app to sign in, and it still works, right? But not everybody has especially when you're talking outside of the tech community. Again, not everybody's using a password manager, or they're just using iCloud, keychain or whatever it is. to store all their passwords. And that's not, yeah. I mean, that works. It's kind of the same idea, but you're giving Apple all that control again. So
Keychain in the cloud.
Keychain in the cloud. It is.
There's other forms of like passwordless authentication. Like I think WhatsApp, all you have to do is prove you own the phone number on the device you're using or something. I think Signal does something similar. I mean, I think we all realize that passwords suck.
Oh yeah, they definitely do, right? I mean, there's other ways to prove identity without passwords, right? And that's what the, especially like the cell phone providers are getting at, right? I worked for a company for a little while that was getting into that space, and that was one of the things they were starting to pull was, hey, if we go talk to all the cell phone vendors, we know exactly who you are based on the EMID of your phone, right? So why do I need a password at that point to log into my online banking if I can provide that same information or that same level of even location information because of the device that you're holding and where it's at, right? So, but I don't think that one's quite come to fruition yet, as opposed to something like the Magic Link. There's easier ways to do it.
I do like the fingerprint option as well. I'm like, so my bank has that option. The company who does my home security has that option. And frankly, like, I'm not really, and I think Kevin Cody talked about this in a little bit, which was, what's your threat model include? Me choosing a crappy password or someone getting my fingerprint. I mean, I'll probably shy more away from using a crappy password that I won't remember when I have to go, sign into a mobile app, versus, being okay with like, yes, test my fingerprint. I'm fine with that. Mm-hmm. So that's my personal opinion, like it's no product design decision or anything like that.
To go back to the password managers, and I know we already agreed that passwords suck, but like password managers suck too. And websites that disallow password managers really suck. And like you mentioned, password managers on mobile are pretty bad. It's getting a little bit better. It's really good if you trust Apple with your passwords. Otherwise, mostly not.
Yep.
So like, I mean, I get really pissed off when websites, especially when they tweet about it. Unfortunately, it's someone who shouldn't be tweeting about it. Say like, we disable password managers for security. We disable paste for security. And it just pisses me off. I am kind of interested in this new like WebAuthn spec. I don't know if it's part of the WebAuthn spec, but it's basically supposed to make credential managers suck less, is kind of the interpretation I have of it.
Yeah.
Actually, any interpretation, because I forgot I was going to do a little homework on it. And then, because when I brought it up with, I think it was Kevin Cody, nobody knew anything about it. I was like, oh, I've heard about it, but I haven't really dug in. Forgot to do the homework. So if like your interpretation would still be more useful than the rambling nonsense I've given so far.
Well, if I leave it at make password managers suck less, I think that's probably the best I can do. So I know the spec has moved around. It used to be like a separate spec and then it got absorbed into a different one. But I hope what it's doing is it's taking away like the heuristics that these password managers have to do on where your username and password field is. And I remember one of the original goals was to make it so that when they fill the value, it's not accessible by JavaScript. I believe they've gone back on that for reasons I never looked into it. But that's kind of the gist I get of it. Because I've been on like github.com and it's like, who do you want to review this pull request? And you see that little asterisk like ready to fill in your password into that field. And it's like, no, I would not like to assign it to my password. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's like the use cases, right? And again, that kind of goes back to the security versus usability discussion that we've been having is that, especially on the offensive side, we don't think about usability as a real issue, but that's what controls a company's bottom line realistically. Right? If you make it too hard to use 2FA, guess what? No one's going to use 2FA. Or a password manager, maybe you start getting less users, right? And especially in the tech space. So is it worth it to the company to actually implement those features just because some consultant came in and said, hey, you should do this, right? You should turn off autocomplete. You should not allow people to cut and paste into this field. And that, I mean, especially on mobile, that's an awful thing, because I remember doing that when mobile apps first came out. Hey, you shouldn't be able to, cut things out of the password field in your app. And now I'm thinking, man, it was a bad decision, because I gave all this code like, hey, you shouldn't be able to actually paste things into it either. Crap, right? That means that people are choosing, QWERTY as their password for their app because that's the only thing that's available to them. So, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't think there's a good solution. WebAuthn looks promising, but I don't know how far along they are in actually developing that standard and when it's going to be implemented.
Sorry, I'm laughing at the chat because there was a question about, does anyone use hardware and like for two-factor auth, and YubiKey was discussed, and then Brian Gray. So Ken Toller had asked that question, and Brian Gray shot back with like the Duo SAML issue from I believe that post was, let's say, 20. Yeah, it was today. And then so he said even if you move to YubiKey, you're one XML parser away from a bad time. He's not wrong. So
yeah, no, he's not, right? I don't know. We've probably beat up on password managers and the crappy state of passwords enough for today. Another good question that came in, though, in the chat was, what do you think is the best approach to make developers to make your developers care about security, right? Like, you've been dealing with developers in that space for longer, right? So what are your thoughts?
First off, you don't be a jerk. You can't sour that relationship. You lose the trust is gone forever. I think El Camtuf, I have no idea how you're supposed to pronounce it. And I can't remember his last name either, but his handle on Twitter is El Camtuf. Yeah. Put out a thing about how to run an effective product security organization. And he talks about this as well. And he talks about sort of the rogue employee going off script who's like, thou shalt not, and pointing fingers, and how that can really just be counterproductive to everything you're trying to do. So yeah, building that relationship is very crucial. I don't know how you do it. It's specific to each organization. Some people just have a good friendly regard with everyone. Some people will help out when, maybe not directly related to what the AppSec team's trying to do, but you can help push things along in a positive way. On the process and technical side, though, building a culture of security such that it's really built into the processes makes a lot of sense, and that widely varies from company to company. At GitHub, all that means is our automated tooling will run every time someone opens a pull request or pushes to a pull request, and our automated robot will go in and throw in only the things it's very, very comfortable about warning people about, because again, if you're too noisy, no one will listen to you. Mm-hmm. And so things like that. So that example I mentioned, I'll elaborate on that. We run breakdown on every push, and we alert people on new warnings in that PR, only the ones that are high or medium confidence. And we've disabled a ton of rules that we feel are either not important enough to ask people to change, or are just sort of too noisy to begin with. The idea being that the pull request, by the time it's merged, all those things should be resolved, or there should be some sort of discussion around it. These are sort of, must-act situations, more or less like a lint test that won't fail the build. Once that code is merged, then we run a second scan with all the bells and whistles turned off, no filtering whatsoever. And the only person that sees those results is, the AppSec team, because in theory, they can glance through it real quickly and decide what requires further action. That building into the existing workflow that already existed before the AppSec team did anything meant that we were pretty much guaranteed to be successful unless we turned people away. Yeah. We didn't ask people to do anything differently than they were already doing. These comments came in, they were a bot, yes, but as long as the comments were always valid, people didn't mind. It was just as if the AppSec team themselves had commented on the issue. So the fact that nobody had to change what they were doing meant that nobody had any trouble adjusting to this whatsoever. Because it was part of the normal workflow, because they were part used to seeing those comments and they were used to seeing people fix them, we didn't have to pester people to fix the issues. It was just culturally, that's just what you did. You cared about the results of this tool, and you wanted to do the right thing. I mean, deep down inside, everybody wants to do the right thing. Everyone wants to write the correct code. No one wants to push crappy code. I mean, unless they're in some ridiculous deadline, but that's a different topic. But like, people want to do the right thing, and if you encourage them to do the right thing and you don't make them feel bad, they'll try to do the right thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, you've touched on a couple of really good points there, right? You know, I mean, relationships, number one, right? What sort of relationship does security or product security, application security have with the rest of the organization, with development? The amount of noise that you're introducing, and the amount of work that you're introducing into their pipeline, right? It's, you know, it's smart to fit into it. That's one thing that I never liked about being a consultant, was coming in once a year, handing off a report. The developers talk about it, but you knew that once you walked away, it was up to them to actually implement. There's not a lot of care and feeding, and whether or not they took it for what it was worth really depended on those developers and who got that message, right? I mean, recently I was dealing with an organization that, you know, I came into, and they're like, hey, we've got like a dependency check style application that's checking all of our pull requests for dependency vulnerabilities, right? And we've enabled it across 100 different repositories, and no one's looking at it because it's too chatty and it's blocking pushes, and so we just ignore it and we move on, right? And I'm like, so you're paying money to actually do this, and you know, you never thought about what was actually being implemented, right? And how to take care of it when it came out. So the first thing that we did is, I'm like, hey, guess what? We're going to make your life easier. We're just going to rip this out, right? And then we're going to start and do it similar to what you're saying, right? Is, guess what? We're going to take a look and we're going to say, guess what? High risk, you know, high severity rated vulnerabilities. Yeah, we'll let you know that they're there, and we can probably block on those and give you a little you know, automate some comments around it on how to fix it. But that's going to be it for now. Right? Anything else, it'll go to us, and we can put in a ticket if it's really something we're concerned about. But you know, realistically, there's only a small amount that a developer needs to care about when they're pushing something out, right? So.
Definitely, and I think that touches on like an important point, not really to the original question, but you talked about a tool that was in place that was basically going to dev null.
Yep.
And it's like, well, they spent the money and the time to develop and do this thing, and it just went nowhere. And like, when you're trying to scale an AppSec program, because typically the AppSec team is usually understaffed when you want to do like an engineer to engineer ratio or whatever, like, I always feel like we never have enough staff, even though I'm in a situation where we might actually have enough staff. But like, the whole idea is like, don't do anything unless it scales.
Yep.
Like, obviously there's going to be the manual one-off code reviews, and the only way to scale code reviews is like better automation in a sense. But it was really interesting once I that light bulb went off. It's like, if you can't automate this, and if those results are not going to be useful, then you are literally wasting your time.
Gee, thanks for summing up my career there, man.
Hey, you charge for it, right?
No, but I totally agree, right? As I deal with more organizations, I realize, you know, especially those first few years of figuring out, like, being a penetration tester, most of those reports were just noise to the different orgs. Yes, you know, some of them would actually implement it, but I mean, Ken, how many times did we go back to an organization like a year or 2 years later and find the same thing we did the year previously?
Almost every time.
Yeah.
To the point where that's like item number 1 on the checklist. Just check what we did before first. You know.
Or, I mean, they would fix, hey, oh wait, they found SQL injection on this one parameter in this one page, and they'd go fix it there. But it's too much work to go through the whole code base, and so you just have to go to like the other parameter on that page, and it was still vulnerable to SQL injection. Right?
Oh yeah, and that's sort of what I was referring to, is the category itself, as well as, I mean, there are instances where they just don't fix that exact instance, but like usually in something as serious SQL as, you know, serious as SQL injection or something like that, they'll fix that one instance, but see, that's sort of the difference. Like, okay, Neil, when you're working with the quality of developers at like a Twitter or a GitHub, that's admittedly a very different crew than like how do I say this without being a jerk? Because I don't want to be a jerk, but I am saying like there are differences in developer skill sets.
Just speed up on Angie's list again.
Yeah, yeah. No, I'll leave Angie's list alone. They probably have great developers.
Yeah,
I'll leave them alone. But you know, there's definitely like, and not just like crews of developers in whatever like space. I'm trying not to like pick on anyone. I'm trying hard, because I could, but we won't. But also like code that's out, like apps that are outsourced and to overseas, where it's just like, you know, cheap labor essentially. So those are another. How did I get off on this tangent, anyways? Where was I going? Oh, right. So like, yeah, it's there's a different level of developer. I guess what I'm saying is Neil's. Have you? Let me ask you, Neil. Have you dealt with any like lower caliber of developer in your career?
I have worked with a wide variety of people in the industry.
Okay.
That was very political. Thank you.
Politically correct. Yeah. I'm trying not to be a jerk, but I think we know what we're getting at. So,
well, and most of the time, to Neil's point, you know, even those like lower caliber or whatever you want to classify them on or as, they don't want to create crappy code, right?
Right.
They don't want to create insecure code. That's not what they're trying to do. Typically, it's the business is driving them. They've got deadlines. They've got features that they have to build. And so they don't have the luxury of a product security team telling them, hey, this needs to be fixed, right? Or it's, you know, 2 years later, they've been handed this steaming pile of code and, hey, now this is my responsibilities, and there are thousands of feature requests and thousands of issues with it. Where does security fall in that? I think it's more of an understaffed problem or, you know, overworked problem than it is a, hey, I just don't care about security problem.
Yeah, I mean that goes to like product management itself, right? That definitely. I mean, you've got a good point. I've definitely seen that too, where it's, you know, someone running around with their hair on fire times however many other product managers there are, with post-it notes all over the wall, no clear direction changes constantly. Business makes, you know, new decisions on new functionality all the time, and basically poor and we talked about this before when we mentioned the Phoenix project, which is just a book illustration of what we've all seen in real life, which is like disastrous project management. So it's not necessarily, you're right, it's not always a code, the coder's fault. It's very much the organization's fault.
So how do you affect change in those organizations? Neil, you've dealt with all types of developers.
Solve this problem.
You're our guest, so we can
got 5 minutes.
So at one organization I was with, our decision was to throw a WAF in front of all of our web applications.
Yeah.
And looking back, I still think that was the right thing to do. We had, I don't know, a couple hundred small little bullshit apps running in somebody's closet on what knows OS, and throwing a WAF in front of all that broke a ton of shit, but it also gave us at least some confidence that we weren't like wide open to the internet. How we did that, I don't know. I mean, we just had the support. I've been fortunate, I guess. I've worked with all sorts of people, but I've always had strong management.
Yeah.
And that was by no, like, it wasn't my suggestion. That was just the project given to me. So I'm sorry, I don't have an answer.
No, it's a question that I don't think we have an answer to, right? I mean, most of the orgs that I'm dealing with obviously takes security somewhat seriously because they're willing to pay for an outside person to come in and actually evaluate or make suggestions or look at code, you know, what have you. And, you know, I know that GitHub takes it seriously. Obviously, both of you are working there. And most of those large corporations do. It's just when you fall down into that smaller space that it becomes a problem, right? They've got one security guy and 50 developers, and the security guy is responsible for endpoint security, you know, firewall, network security, and application security, right? It's just not a situation that they're going to succeed in to prevent vulnerabilities from being introduced into the code.
Yeah, which is yet a situation that happens. I mean, that happens all the time. I mean, my personal response is different from like, I bet you, Neil, you and I probably have the same outlook, but correct me if I'm wrong. I'm like, if your organization stinks that much, just there's plenty of jobs out there, leave and go find a better one. Like, honestly, but that is not solving the root problem, right? I mean, and that's sort of, I mean, because, you know, there are not a ton of AppSec people in ratio with the need. So it is easy to move on. But if you want to do the, if you want to stick with it, you like the org, even though you're having some issues. I think what every single person does who's on a 1 or 2 person team is it's always the same kind of formula. You set up automation, set up relationships, set up awareness. I mean, those are the factors that I think everyone always does, or those are the things that everyone always does. I'm not sure that anything's super novel. I mean, I think the one thing to add to that is like pretty much what you're saying, Neil, which is when you do automation, try to make it not a crappy solution, which means if you're an organization, you need to hire somebody with both a technical background, but also kind of like, I don't want to say strategic, but some level of an effective communicator, someone who can build positive relationships. But anyways, so when you talk about automation, it's exactly what you said, Neil, not having like crappy, pointless, loud results. So choosing the right tech stack, but also like, chat ops has obviously made our life a lot easier, can make developers' lives a lot easier. Integrating, especially on the AppSec side, with like their whatever technology they're using, and this is the same thing you're talking about with pull requests on GitHub. It's the same thing as like interfacing with like their Jira bug tracking system, automating some of what you do with that. Whether it be like introducing tickets or alerting on like, hey, this has been in here, this is a priority 0, or this is a high risk issue or whatever, and it's X amount of days past, our recommended remediation. So I don't know. That's my expanded version on like my normal response, which is like, go find another job. So
go find a new job. I mean, that's not always a possibility, obviously, but definitely it is available because of the space that we're in. The other thing I wanted to bring up was the developer training that you mentioned, Ken, right? Is you've got to find, I mean, it goes back to the relationships we were talking about earlier. You got to find the people in the organization that care enough that you can train them up to be quasi-security people, right? Especially on the development team, if you can find a couple of those guys that know security or are interested in it, eventually some of them may pop over to the product security team, but they'll be your biggest advocates, and they'll be the first ones to jump on any of those vulnerabilities and any of those tools that you automate, so that you're not the one that's having to do that.
I mean, in a lot of ways, those people are more important than we are.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they're the ones that's where the rubber hits the road. That's where it actually gets fixed.
They're literally doing the reviews too, like before codes merged, right? So, like we have a good system with automation, right? For like, but actually, there's nothing that's ever going to beat a human who knows what they're doing with eyes on code, reviewing it, and doing basically a quality control check before that actually ships.
Yeah. Yeah. We had one more question from Magno again. This one was, do you think that the OWASP top 10 proactive controls is a good start material to focus on with your dev team?
Well, Jim's going to hate me for not knowing these ones very well.
I mean, my initial was, oh, well, yeah, he's talking about the OWASP top 10, but the proactive controls are not as well publicized, right, as the top 10 vulnerabilities or the, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at it right now. I mean, we can just read it off.
Yeah, I'm Googling too.
I mean,
I don't know why.
Verify for security early and often. I mean, I think that's exactly what we're trying to say. Like, the earlier you catch a bug, the cheaper it is. You can automate it. It's basically free. You can do it as often as you want or continually.
Yep.
Parameterized queries, like, yeah, don't mix code and data. SQL injection is an example of that. Parameterized queries help you separate code and data. which in theory eliminates SQL injection if your framework actually does real parameterized queries.
Command injection too, right? I mean, you can parameterize system commands if you needed to do it.
Yeah. I guess that's, yeah, it's mentioning queries specifically, but I guess.
Oh, right, yeah.
Command.
Good point.
Encode data, always contextually validate all inputs. So I'm one of the weird people. I think that input validation is mostly like a user-facing feature, other than things like strings of infinite length that can't fit into your database. Like people a lot of times validate input means strip out things that would cause SQL injection or XSS in fields that should not have HTML. And I'm just like, if you encode it and you parameterize it, who cares what it is? I don't know if I seem to be pretty alone on that thought.
No, I agree. When I've gotten pushback, it's usually because I have the same kind of thought, but usually when I get pushback, it's like, well, have you thought about second order injection? And I'm like, how many cases have you seen in real life of second order injection being the thing that took, and like, maybe I'm putting my foot in my mouth, but and probably should have done my homework before I said that on YouTube. But yeah, I don't. That's not a real huge concern, I guess, for me personally.
Yeah, I mean, the only argument against that from more recent attacks that are going on is kind of the server-side request forgery stuff that goes on. If you aren't clearing out URLs, if you're doing lookups on host names that are provided and that kind of thing, it can end up biting you, right? But that doesn't necessarily fall into an input validation problem. That's a injection problem again. So
a boundary problem, a ACL problem,
network security problem. Yeah, there's all sorts of things that have to fail for those to be effective. Looking over that list of proactive controls, I'm glad someone brought that up, because that's definitely kind of a formula for, hey, here's 10 things that I can write into a security program that are effective, right?
I am saying, I just thought about this because I am sitting here kind of shitting on validating input. But to be fair, when we talked about that SSRF, that server-side request forgery issue, I don't know if that was last week or the week before, when I talked about that, like the whole thing was, or at least one instance, because it was like a bunch of different vulns chained together, but one of them was like, the biggest thing was not correctly blacklisting the input. So yeah, I guess I can't completely say there's no merit to that. There are cases where everything's contextual. It's not like one rule that everyone has to follow.
One thing I do like about this proactive controls thing, as opposed to, like, say, just the generic top 10, is that it's much more developer focused. I feel like anyone who's done development probably knows most of these terms, but not anyone who's done development knows all of the OWASP top 10 terms. I think insecure direct object reference is a classic example of this sort of disconnect between security and development. But things like verify for security early and often, implement logging and intrusion. Well, maybe that's not for developers, but at least logging is.
Yeah. No, that's a great list, actually. I'm glad that Magno, I'm glad you brought that up, and Brian, you too, right? As far as where we implement that and putting some sort of standardization around what goes into your applications is a fairly critical piece of the puzzle, right?
Yeah,
cool.
Definitely.
So, yeah, we're at 55 minutes, and I don't think we've talked about any of the topics that Ken had on his list.
Told you. Well, maybe a little bit with the building security into a startup, because that's kind of what.
Yeah, that is what we're talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
So we got one.
It would kind of segue nicely into CSP, because I think someone mentioned security requirements built into their specs.
Yeah, and exactly, like secure headers is a great example of that. But please, Neil, you can speak to it. Obviously, we brought you on to speak to it. So
I think CSP is a wonderful tool. And in terms of building standards into their specs, I think having CSP on all your applications from the start is a great way to make your app more secure today, but then also make sure it doesn't become less secure over time. So when I was working at Twitter, we developed secure headers to sort of retroactively apply CSP to all of our applications. And it had decent success. We got CSP just about everywhere in terms of Rails land. Maybe it wasn't the strongest policy, but it was something. But what I thought was really interesting was when Twitter was decomposing from Rails to the Scala framework, not from day one, but like close enough to day one where they started serving like non-API traffic from the Scala framework. We made sure that we integrated a secure headers like feature into it, and that we had CSP and all the other headers applied by default. So every single new HTML endpoint that came up had all the headers by default. They didn't have to do anything. It had a strict CSP that was like relatively locked down, but didn't make it so that everyone had to jump through some hoop. Like we whitelisted the Twitter CDN for styles on everybody. We whitelisted, unsafe inline CSS for everyone because it was just not practical at the time. But we did not allow eval or inline script or third-party JavaScript or Flash or Java applets or any of these other things that were just like really scary at the time. So that became our security standard. And everyone pretty much was able to work with that. We gave people the ability to opt out of things, but every time they did, our automation would catch it. One thing people always ask is like, do we have a brakeman for Scala? It's no, we had something called regular expressions. That went very, very far, because when you build things secure by default and you make people opt out of the secure way of doing things, you don't need static analysis. You just need grep. So we could basically figure out every time someone was changing the CSP, and we could say like, that's fine, that's not fine. Hey, why don't you just throw that under our CDN instead of sourcing it from Google? The other nice thing is nobody was able to add any third-party integrations to our site without us knowing about it. People say that CSP is about stopping cross-site scripting, but it's also about stopping third-party integrations that you did not approve. I see multiple people tweet about this, about so-and-so's team that wants to increase monthly active users has thrown some shady third-party thing, and guess what? It doesn't work, and they don't necessarily know how to work around it. Security finds out, no more third-party integration. So getting that in from like day one pretty much means that if anyone wants to do something that is not by your standards, like they have to not ask for permission, but it's really hard to sneak it by you. And if you keep that in from day one, you don't have to put any work into like making it work. Like retroactively applying CSP is incredibly painful, but like building in from day one is so easy, and keeping it secure is fairly easy for the most part as well.
So it's been probably, I don't know, five months maybe I've been on the team. And in that time, because of what you've built and the fact that when a CSP exception needs to be made, we do get an alert. I mean, we've detected, like you said, several third-party integrations, a couple efforts that were like much larger in scope than we were aware of until we got that alert. And just a ton of good questions and conversations around changes. So like what Neil's saying, I can confirm actually really works super well. So for what it's worth.
So I mean, for somebody in a product security role that doesn't have CSP or hasn't like implemented it before, where do you recommend that they go to actually start?
So I think if you're okay with it, I think you should use a reporting service like reporturi.io.
Okay.
CSP has a reporting functionality, and you can send it off to a third party. And Scott actually does a pretty good job of filtering out a lot of the garbage reports, because anyone who's ever looked at all of their CSP reports can tell you that 80% of them are absolute garbage and are just a waste of time in space. So he does a lot of the filtering there, and you can sort of group and sort and search over all your violations such that you can tune your policy over time. I think that's a really good thing to do if you just sort of have a massive application that you don't really understand all the nooks and crannies of. But if you have a smaller application and maybe you have someone that knows all the nooks and crannies, I definitely suggest installing, there's dozens of different browser extensions that let you just modify the policy for a certain page.
Okay.
I just use Casper Enforcer because it's what I've been using since it was written. It's really nice. It has all the directives broken down. It starts with a sensible default policy. And then you sort of click around on the page, see what's broken, look at your console, fix each individual warnings, come up with like some baseline policy you can apply throughout your entire application. First of all, that's going to be too lenient because let's say you have like one page that has inline script. Well, you don't want to necessarily open up for the entire app, but just to get it going, just get a policy that works for your entire application. And then from there, figure out what you want to tighten down. For example, maybe you want to remove that unsafe inline script for that one page. So you make a dynamic policy just for that one page, and now you've protected the rest of your app. Then look at the third parties you might be using. You might be pulling in jQuery from a third-party source when you really don't need to be doing that. So then you can move it to your CDN and reduce the number of third parties that are in your policy. Because pretty much every time you have a third party in your policy, that's either an exfil avenue or it's just you're opening yourself up to cross-site scripting. Like GitHub CSP, the only place we're allowed to load JavaScript is from our CDN. CSP is hard. It's very hard. There's a lot of edge cases that I won't even get into. Once you've sort of eliminated all your third parties, I mean, you really get into the weeds. You start looking at the sort of less common directives, like blocking mixed content or upgrading insecure requests, or your form action attribute, which says where you can post forms to, because that's not governed by your default source. I mean, the rabbit hole goes deep, but the gist is find a policy that works for everything and then start sniping out the individual pieces that you don't like of your policy. And if you want me to review a policy, I'm happy to tell you what's wrong with it, or where at least I would focus on. I think Ken and I were having a conversation this week, and I was kind of like, well, that's not an ideal policy because this, and this. And it's totally not obvious. And I only know these things because I've been doing CSP for like 7 years now, and I know all these edge cases.
Neil was the first person first and only person I reached out to about this, because I'm like, oh, and what's weird is I had this question and Neil, you knew it, but what's funny is then like the next day, because this was specifically around setting this with Helmet, and the very next day, the author of Helmet reaches out to you and I over Twitter. Super random. I mean, I hadn't talked to him. You hadn't talked to him, right?
I don't know the person.
Yeah. So that just was very strange, but very cool. Have you?
We were talking about a very esoteric part of CSP as well.
Yeah. It was super random, but yeah, I mean, because that was the gist, right? It was like, oh, it's not super obvious, and the Helmet documentation could use an update to explain that. And the next day, and I still haven't reached back, taken him up on his offer to reach out. I don't know if you have yet.
Nope.
Cool. Note to self. Let's follow up on that. So yeah, CSP.
Yeah.
The war stories.
It does. It sounds a lot like implementing a security program as it is, right? What we were talking about with tooling previously. Hey, let's make it wide, make it as low impact as possible initially, and then tune it to what you want it to be, right? It's always a slow approach for security. Not necessarily slow in time, but one thing at a time. The more items that you throw at the developers, the less likely it is that any of them are going to get fixed. So,
well, I feel like at least I get the feeling that the whole security and development thing, like we're moving in the right direction.
Yeah.
Like 10 years ago, like even what we're talking about today would have probably been like impossible for whatever reason. Like things are always going into the right direction, and to like make a terrible like tie back to CSP, like CSP is getting easier to apply as well. And the easier CSP is to apply, the more people will do it, the better off we are. Like for example, the whole CSP is introducing this, it's not introducing, it exists, this concept of like strict dynamic, where like, as long as your script tag has a nonce that matches what's in the header, like that script tag kind of gets carte blanche. So if it like loads another resource, or like let's say it loads a dynamic resource, you don't have to account for that in your CSP. And like, while that may or may not open you up to other kinds of attacks, at least you've got a CSP and you've eliminated your inline injection attacks, for example.
Yeah.
So I like the, things are getting better.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and that's where you see, right? Just the fact that we're talking product security now instead of just strict like consultants and application security, right? We're, as a security org, we're moving more and more into the development space. And half of what we're talking about here, we have to have developers to actually implement this tooling, right? How much of what we do on a daily basis is actually code versus just turning on some tool and running it, which it was 10, 12 years ago.
Yeah.
And analyzing the results.
Yeah. By hand, manually.
Up a hill in snow without shoes.
Ken's been around for a long time.
You're the one with the silver in your hair, so
yeah, that's what kids does to you. Don't worry, you'll get there.
Yeah, only got the one. Awesome. Cool. I know that I know we're running over, but that's fine. We can always go over as much as we want. This is our show. So, but I did want to make sure that were there any topics? I mean, because we hadn't talked about the Duo SAML piece. I don't think we talked about that yet, have we?
No.
Okay, because I think we had just, the reason I say is I remember us chatting about it briefly before we started. I was verifying it was before we started. My memory sucks. So cool. So if anyone hadn't heard, and let me drop the link in here, but basically Duo Kelby Ludwig at Duo had published a vulnerability or a finding in how XML essentially parses pieces of a SAML message, right? So meaning, I think the examples they used for Ruby and for Python was XML for Ruby, but what was it? LXML or something like that? Yeah, LXML for Python. So those parsers break down node. Basically, here's the gist. You've got a what should be just an attribute in a string, what you would consider just a string value, but because of the way that the XML specs or the way these XML parsers were written, if there are comments inside of that XML attribute, they will be allowed. So meaning if it was changed in some way, it doesn't mean that the signature, when I say changed in some way, I mean specifically something added in the comments. It doesn't change the signature of the XML message. What it does do, however, is alter the way that XML attributes parsed. So the way that it works is, and I think the example they had was like K Ludwig, and they did like K la comment wig, and when broken down by the parser, by the LXML parser, I think is the example they showed, it's actually 3 parts versus like one long string. So meaning you can effectively bypass checks, the XML like character, or sorry, the string checks by injecting some additional data into like something like the name ID. So it is effectively a SAML bypass, or that's the way that it's presented in this article, but through specifically XML parsing, canonicalization, and I feel like there's something else. There's I believe 3 parts to this that make it work. There's the canonicalization. I think they even said 3 parts. Yeah, SAML responses that contain strings that identify the authenticating user. That's how SAML works. XML canonicalization. So we talked about that. And then text extraction. Yeah, so that's the 3 parts. That's the how XML parses it, the fact that that in some cases comments are ignored, and obviously the name ID in this situation in their example is what you, the name ID.
Yeah. Basically, XML parsing sucks.
Go figure.
Go figure. And, I know this is a SAML-specific vulnerability or exploit that they're talking about, but if you start to extrapolate that out, on one of the Slack channels that I'm in, somebody was talking about it, being like, guess what? This isn't just a SAML issue.
Yeah.
Anybody that uses these XML parsers, you could take advantage of this, and there's no telling on what you can do. It all depends on what that app is doing with that XML parsed text string, right? So yeah, there's going to be more that comes out of this one. It's not just the SAML issue that we're dealing with.
Shouldn't those control characters have been escaped too? Like, presuming if this came from some like user input, shouldn't those?
Well, no, because it's considered like, because they have the 2 specs, right? They have the like, you can completely ignore. So yes, you're right, but I think that what they were relying on were the specification. Actually, I think what he noted in that article was that it was very unintuitive and not well documented that's how the spec works, like the whole with comments or without comments piece to that. So like, nobody probably expected basically those characters to ever exist inside of that, because they assumed that the signature would not match up with the actual data provided, I think is the gist.
Yeah, that was definitely eye-opening to me. I did not think that would have been possible.
Which is why it's so cool. I mean, you got to love the Duo research group, right? There's a lot of cool stuff that they're working on, both from a defensive and an offensive perspective. So
I can't wait to see what else this affects. Now, granted, like, so the SAML authors, like, they named a couple. And by the way, Evan Johnson pointed out that, like, even though there's this pretty heavy disclosure timeline originating, the whole thing started in December, on December 18th of last year to now. And so everybody should have known, but like, the link Heaven provided was like a Python SAML library, where I think he said it was something like 4 o'clock this morning they were making changes to the library. Anyways, tangent aside, everyone's making the updates to the SAML parsing library, but I think that you hit on a good point. Like, totally expect for this to affect other things, and for there to be more to come with this.
Yeah. Jerry summarized it as hacking doing what no one ever expected until it works, right? Which is a pretty good description, right? We think about all the payloads that we throw at things, but it's always kind of that expected character set, even if it's like our expected character set. But yeah, there always seems to be some little way around it, or something else that pops up that we didn't think about.
Yeah, and that's the thing with stuff like this. When it gets released, it makes it opens up another avenue of thought for like researchers and just for the rest of us. Like, oh, that's something that I should think about. Like, whether it's in your product or whether it's, you're a researcher looking for bugs in some project. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Cool. So. No, good deal. I mean, we've been going for
Well, I was going to ask Neil any additional thoughts on this before we close that topic out.
XML is garbage? I don't know. I mean,
Why are you people still using it?
Even when it's not like a problem with XML itself, yeah, it's just like the Rails apocalypse always seemed to involve XML problems.
Yeah.
XXE attacks, all these. I mean, SAML is itself like a vulnerability.
So you don't think SOAP's going to make a comeback?
Oh God, I remember writing SOAP and then forgetting to escape my quotes and angle brackets. I would break my XML documents.
Whistles all day long.
You joke, but sometimes they're nice.
Brian brings up a good point. A few episodes ago, he said no one would use SOAP in XML. Well,
oh dang.
Here we go. Well, this is why we maybe that was more of where it should go, and this is a good example of why. So I'm going to spin that.
There you go. Good call. All right. Well, good. I mean, we've been going for what, hour 15 or something like that. Neil, any last minute advice or thoughts before we call it for this week?
I'll just double down. XML is garbage. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
You guys watch Jesus and Mira? I don't know if you do, but they do this thing at the end of every interview where it's like a rainbow and it's their catchphrase, and that would be my catchphrase for the day.
XML is garbage. I'll see what I can figure out as we post this on YouTube.
You know what? We're gonna put that in the description, Seth.
Yeah.
XML is garbage by Neil. Or let's work that into the title somehow. For sure. For sure.
For sure. All right. We will. Good call.
Neil, don't jump off when we stop the broadcast. But yeah, thank you for coming on. And like, I wish people could sit with Neil, and if you go to Locomocosec, you can, but if you could just kind of listen to some of Neil's experiences, if you ever get the chance to meet him, hang out, absorb some of this guy's knowledge, he's and experiences. So Neil, thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Neil.
Thanks for having me.
All right, well, we'll close it out. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.